So thanks once again for inviting me to speak at this. And I would just like to, before I start talking about biology in the 21st century and how we get here, I would just like to make a brief point that it is a little unfortunate that as it has worked out, all the speakers in this particular celebration of science event happen to be male. And it would have actually been much nicer and much more fitting if we had also had a good representation of female scientists as speakers, because especially since this is aimed at school students, one does not want to convey even inadvertently an impression that science is somehow a man's activity and not really a woman's activity. That is not at all what either any of us or the academy is trying to convey. It just so happens that this particular event, it turned out this way. But so please don't take the wrong message from it. So I'd like to start a little bit by talking about why I chose this particular theme for this talk and why I think it's important to talk about some of these things. The first reason is, of course, that biology is very important. And right now, as we are 1.5 years into the latest pandemic, which is COVID, which has been much worse than many of the preceding ones in the last several decades, we do appreciate that biology is terribly important to dealing with and trying to solve or ameliorate problems that face us as humans, as societies. At the same time, although biology is very important, the way we teach and to a reasonable degree, the way we do research in biology today, especially in India, is rather out of date and lopsided. And I want to qualify this statement a little bit. I mean, why am I saying it's out of date? It's not out of date in terms of the technologies we use. It is out of date in the terms of the conceptualizations that we use. How we think about phenomena in biology is what is a bit out of date now in India, especially. In some sense, if you would like to think of it another way, we are trying to do 21st century biology with a very 20th century thinking about biology, even though some of our technologies have become 21st century. And this is seriously reflected in the way we teach biology. And one of the things I want to do with this talk is also give you a bit of a flavor of what biology is really like logically as a subject. And its sort of broadly encompassing reach in terms of the kinds of questions, the kinds of techniques, the kinds of approaches that are used. Because very often what happens in school with many people is you are interested in things where you have to think rather than subjects where you have to memorize. And the way biology is taught in school, often the impression is created that if you are the thinking kind of student, you would like to, take physics and mathematics. And if you are not so much into thinking and you don't mind memorizing lots of things and making beautiful drawings, then you might want to take biology. So a lot of biology students in India often end up in biology, not because they're particularly excited about biology, but because they're scared of mathematics and physics. And that really should not be the case. There is a lot of thinking to be done in biology as well, even though it might not necessarily be apparent from the way biology is often taught at the school level. And there is an underlying logic to biology also, which again doesn't often come out very well. The way we teach biology tends to be a collection of facts without much of an underlying logic. But there is an underlying logic in biology, and that is provided by our appreciation of the process of evolution. And the reason I think it's important to bring up some of these things is because these are things you don't get in the course of your normal school and early college education. And it's important to understand how biology grew, how there have been sort of these cycles of more integrative periods in biology versus periods of greater specialization in biology and so on, and understand where we are today, where biology is today and will be in some sense for the next few decades when many of you guys will be growing up and becoming scientists yourself. And we need to understand some of our biases in biology if we want to properly harness our understanding of the living world to actually deal with a lot of the problems that we are facing as societies, quite in addition to having the pleasure of furthering our understanding of the living world itself. I mean, I am a basic scientist, and so my major excitement is to contribute to our understanding of the living world. But I do also appreciate as a citizen that there are practical problems also where we need a lot of input from biology. And again, what I'm going to try to illustrate is that that input from biology needs to come in a little different way than it is coming right now. Right now, we are a bit lopsided. We are focusing a bit too much on molecular biology as if that is the only important thing in modern biology. And that is actually a very dangerous fallacy to fall into. Most of our problems, and we'll see some of these as we go along, are not going to get solved by molecular biology alone or by fancy molecular biology technology alone. They are going to require a much more integrative and comprehensive approach, which is going to have to rest on very strong foundations of an understanding of ecological and evolutionary processes. So what are some of these problems? And this is just a very partial list. Biggest one right now, it rings true for all of us, is new diseases where some pathogen shifts from another animal to humans, and we have a new human disease coming up. Of course, COVID has been pretty big in terms of its spread and the amount of disruption of lives and livelihoods, etc., that it has brought about. But every few years, many of you might recall, we have had swine flu, bird flu, Southeast Asian respiratory syndrome virus, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome virus, and so on. So these new diseases keep arising because pathogens are shifting from animals to humans. And once again, why these kinds of shifts happen? What is it about the ecology or environmental changes or habitat degradation or climate changes that can alter the likelihood of pathogens jumping from one species to the other and perhaps jumping to humans from other animals? All these topics are broadly under the domain of what people study when they study ecology and evolution, not really within the domain of people studying molecular biology. Multi-drug resistance in bacteria is a very big thing. You might all have read about it even in the media or heard about it in the media. Bacteria are increasingly acquiring resistance even to 5th and 6th generation antibiotics that they have not even been exposed to too much. And again, multi-drug resistance is an evolved trait for the bacteria. The bacteria are undergoing an evolutionary process by which they are acquiring this resistance with its horrendous impact on our lives. I actually lost my mother a few years ago because she had to be admitted to hospital for a relatively trivial problem, and while she was there, she got infected by a multi-drug resistant bacteria and she died within 2 days. This is a huge problem facing all societies, not just India today. And again, understanding multi-drug resistance and therefore being in a position to try to deal with it requires really a very solid understanding of ecology, evolution, not just molecular biology. Cancer, for many decades, was thought to be the domain where molecular biology was going to give us magic bullets and magic pills to deal with cancer, and that really didn't happen. One of the early observations with chemotherapy was that the first round is often effective, then it becomes less effective, then it becomes less effective. And many decades ago, evolutionary biologists were actually pointing out that, you really need to treat the growing tumor, the growing cancer in your body from an evolutionary perspective, because it is a mass of rapidly dividing cells that are all descendants of one original cell that somehow changed and became cancerous and started dividing. So this is a population of cells. And just like any other population which is reproducing itself, it will evolve. When you challenge it with chemotherapy, it will evolve resistance to chemotherapy. And now, after so many decades, actually, the field of oncology or cancer studies in biomedical science now has fully integrated a proper evolutionary approach and understanding to how we are trying to devise better and more effective techniques of managing and dealing with cancer. Sustainable agriculture is again one thing in which biology needs to play a huge role. And again, it's an example of a major societal problem, global problem, where the solution is not going to come just from molecular biology. Understanding the effects of climate change and habitat fragmentation or degradation on how species ranges change, how pathogens can jump species and acquire new hosts. All this is again very, very important. And finally, even properly understanding various pathologies of human social behavior is something where an evolutionary perspective can help quite a lot. So all of these massive problems, which also have tremendous socio-political aspects to them, these are all problems that need public policy, they need societal consensus for us to address, but these are also problems that really need a lot of input from biological knowledge to address, and that biological knowledge needs to be very integrative and very ecological, very evolutionary in nature. Only a knowledge of molecular biology will not take us very far towards dealing with any of these problems. And given that, it is important to bring up the issue of how lopsided our biology teaching and research activities in India have become. Because in India for the last 3-4 decades, the impression you would get as an ordinary educated citizen would be that the only important biology is molecular biology. And somehow genetic engineering, small molecules, targeted drug discovery, all this is going to solve all our problems. And unfortunately, it's not, for very sound reasons. So we need to deal a little bit about this particular issue and what biology really today is like in the world and what it needs to become like even in India in our education and our research activities. So that is roughly what I'm trying to do with today's talk. So if we go back a long time in time, from the time that we actually have some reasonable written record, so I'm looking at maybe 3,000 years ago, 1000 BCE to about 500 CE, what used to be called AD. And there were many areas marked by stars here. These are all the usual culprits, the ancient civilizations, China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, ancient Greece. There were also civilizations in very ancient times in Central America and South America, but we don't have much writings from that time surviving. So we don't know that much about what they were doing in terms of how they were thinking about biology. Biology really springs very directly from day-to-day human interests. So biology, basically what we call biology, has crystallized and grown out in the last 200-300 years from interests in medicine, how to treat illnesses, interests in husbandry, that is to say, for example, cattle rearing, goat rearing, sheep rearing, maintaining crops of grains and so on. Breeding animals and plants to try to develop better varieties, cows which give more milk, oxen which are larger and can carry heavier loads and so on. And finally, natural history. And what I mean by natural history is what today we often call ecology, the understanding of all the living things around us, the physical environment, the biological environment, how species are all intertwined in nature. And this natural history in some sense precedes even medicine, husbandry and breeding, because natural history was very important even while we were just beginning to evolve some of our more characteristically human social traits like civilization and agriculture and so on. We still had to hunt, we still had to gather food, we still had to avoid becoming somebody else's dinner. And all that contributed to our understanding of ecology or natural history. And this is largely what was going on in this time in the ancient world. From about 500 CE to 800 CE, there was a period of considerable political turmoil in Europe and Asia. The collapse of major empires in, for example, northern India, in the Iranian plateau, in the Roman Empire collapsed, the Sasanian Empire in Iran collapsed, the Gupta Empire in India collapsed, and there was a lot of disruption of trade, so economic situations were bad. And during this time, perhaps there was work which has not survived, but it seems as if among the surviving works that we have, not too much new was done at this time. There was some amount of collation of work being done in Central Asia. And by Central Asia, I mean what are today the areas of roughly northern Afghanistan, northeastern Iran, the present day countries of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And the location of Central Asia is very important. This was literally at the crossroads of the Eurasian landmass. So here's Turkey, Greece, Rome, Europe to the west, Iran down here, India down here, China down here. So all these trade routes from China towards the west, from India towards the west and the north, from India towards China, from the west towards India or towards China, all of them passed through Central Asia. It was sort of like the mercantile crossroads of the Eurasian landmass. And because of that, a lot of knowledge from all different parts of the world used to also end up spreading into Central Asia. And some collation was done at that time. In India, we often have a slightly misleading impression of Central Asia, that it's a place of very fierce, barbaric, nomadic horsemen who every now and then used to come and invade India and invade Iran and so on. But apart from the nomads in Central Asia has a very long history of urban civilization also, contemporaneous even with the Indus Valley civilization in the Indian subcontinent. And there were great trade links and other intellectual links even between the Indus Valley civilization and the older Central Asian urban civilizations. The next 500 years or so, from about 800 CE to 1300 CE, was really a tremendous golden period of science, not just biology, in the broader Middle East, from Central Asia all the way up to Baghdad. And this was a time when all the scientific activity was really concentrated in this belt. And the thing that happened was that these people had learned from prior knowledge of the Chinese, the Indians, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, collated it together, commented upon it, extended it further, and added a lot of new work to it. This is also the time when a lot of novel scientific discoveries are made in Central Asia, broadly speaking. This is what often in your books you might find described as the golden period of Arab science or Islamic science, but it is actually more accurate to refer to it as Central Asian science. Yes, most of those people who were doing this work were Muslims, and most of them were writing in Arabic, even though Arabic was not their mother tongue. Because Arabic, like Sanskrit in India and Latin later on in Europe, was sort of a prestige language in which all the scholarly books were written. But these were all typically Central Asian guys from that area I just described. And in biology, these interests in medicine, husbandry, breeding, and natural history continued, were extended further. A lot of progress in all these happened. And in biology, we also began to see some initial differentiation between the study of form or biological structures, what today you would call anatomy, morphology, and histology, and so on, and the study of function, what today you would call physiology. So these began to specialize and gradually separate a little bit, although often it was the same scientists who were studying both form and function. In fact, in that period, it was typically the same scientists who were doing research in biology also, medicine, in mathematics also, in astronomy also, in philosophy also, and in irrigation engineering also. Okay, so the era of super specialization had still not happened. Between 1300 to 1700, roughly, the focus of scientific activity now shifted comprehensively to Europe. This was also a period where gradually Europe became economically more powerful, and towards the later part of this period, European countries began to explore and then colonize other parts of the world. So they also had money. They also had exposure to appreciating the diversity of life forms across the length and breadth of the globe, because they were traveling so much by sea to all kinds of continents. And Europe really accessed all the ancient knowledge, including the previous speaker, Professor Tirthankar, mentioned Euclid. Most of Euclid's work is no longer available in the original Greek. It was all lost in the Greek, but the Arabic translations made by the Central Asian mathematicians are what survived and came back to Europe, and that got back translated into Latin, for example. So Europe accessed a lot of ancient science, including their own ancient science from Greece, and science from China and India and Mesopotamia and so on, via the Central Asian work, which was translated into Latin during this period, during the Renaissance in Europe. A lot of Latin translations of these Arabic language works were done, and they really formed the foundation for the explosive crystallization of modern day science over the next 400 years, from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s in Europe, with Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, and all those people coming along. So this is really when the focus of what's new and happening in science actually shifted to Europe, and to a reasonable degree, it still remains in Europe, although the dominance of Europe is not as comprehensive as it was earlier. And I should add here, when I say it still remains with Europe, I am including countries like United States, Canada, and Australia as culturally, intellectually, scientifically a part of Europe, an extension of Europe. From the 1700s to the 1800s, modern day biology begins to crystallize. Form and physiology studies get ever more sophisticated. During the late 1600s, microscopy comes up, and that allows people to study both very small living creatures, microscopic creatures, microbes. So it opens up a whole new living universe to scientists. And we are also able to study larger creatures like ourselves in greater anatomical detail because of developments in microscopy, and also in trying to understand the functioning of different parts of the body and organ systems in the body. Much of the recent understanding from physics and chemistry about pressures and flows and chemical reactions, all that is also coming in to biology during this time. And the 1700s is really when a lot of strands of modern day biology begin to crystallize. And my apologies for the handmade nature of this slide. I sort of ran out of time when I was doing this. I'll just go through this in some detail. So this is about what's happening in the 1700s. At this point, the action is mostly in Europe. This little black vertical line in the middle is sort of separating the activities of people who are largely interested in studying and understanding form, and those who are largely interested in studying and understanding function. Couple of things I want to point out here, because these are things which changed over the next 100 years. One is that if you look at embryology, the study of how a single fertilized egg eventually grows into a multicellular organism by the process of development and differentiation. Embryology was a relatively smallish field in the 1700s within the broader interest in the study of form, how form develops within an individual's given lifetime. Heredity, what we today call genetics, and I'll talk more about why it's perhaps better to call it heredity, was very much in the domain of people who are interested in function. And the kinds of people who are interested in heredity were people studying medicine from the point of view of hereditary diseases. In fact, it was one of the Central Asian great medical researchers called Avicenna or Ibn Sina who first very seriously started looking at and categorizing different kinds of heritable diseases. People just studying zoology, botany, explaining function of plants and animals were also interested in heredity, but more as heredity as one aspect of reproduction. And then, of course, there were the breeders who were really interested in heredity in the 1700s. And the breeders and the medical people were the ones who really started thinking seriously about what is heredity and how we should conceptualize and think about heredity. Remember, this is before we have any knowledge of genes or Mendel's laws or anything. We don't know. It's a mystery why individuals tend to resemble their parents, yet they are not identical to their parents. And a lot of conceptual work was done in the late 1700s, particularly in France, on this issue by medical people. In the bottom here, below this green horizontal line, is people who are sort of not so much interested in single organisms, single individuals and what's going on in their bodies, but who are interested in variability across time and space, variation on different continents, variations from the past to the present. So paleontology has already become a field. People have realized that you discover remains of many species which clearly are not existing today. And systematics, this blue box here, is taking into account variation and trying to explain and classify variation both in terms of form and function across species and across time and space. And natural history, the study of living organisms in their natural habitat, what we today call ecology, that is beginning to spread its domain from trying to also understand the functioning of organisms in their natural habitat, not just which organism is found in which continent and so on, but also which other species they coexist with, how do they interact, what are their relationships with each other, and how those compositions seem to have changed over geological time. In other words, how does the assemblage of species in the fossil record in a given area compared to the present day assemblage of species and so on. So all this is happening. It's a period of great churn and lot of new kinds of thinking happening in ecology, where people are all happening in biology, I'm sorry, and people are also trying to bring in the new understandings coming from subjects like physics and chemistry and using them to also try to understand what the living world is and why it is the way it is. The 1800s are perhaps the very, very important century in biology up to that time. And please remember, in terms of the timeline, the mid 1800s, 1850s, 1860s is around the time when Darwin comes up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, and Mendel comes up with his explanations of how characters are transmitted and invokes these factors which we now call genes and explains how they seem to behave. And now we understand that, of course, those genes are located on chromosomes, and Mendel in his laws basically described what happens to homologous chromosomes during meiotic cell division leading to gamete formation. The beauty of it is that Mendel inferred what was happening to the chromosomes and the hereditary factors about 30 years before people had even discovered or described the process of meiotic cell division. So again, the basic structure of this figure is the same as the previous one, but now many things have changed and become bigger. Embryology has now become a much bigger science than it was. It has embraced function as well as form, and it is really influencing people in zoology and botany in a very big way. It is also beginning to influence some people in systematics. There are some overlaps now. And embryology or embryologists are beginning to take interest in heredity, but in terms of the inheritance of species characteristics or similarities. Why is the offspring of a myna always a myna and not an eagle, for example? Breeders in the early 1800s, even before Darwin, are really beginning to advance the principles of heredity. And in fact, several things that come up during the early 1800s, before Darwin and before Mendel, One is that a compatriot of Mendel who lives in the same city about 30 years before Mendel, but working with sheep rather than plants, actually comes up more or less with something very similar to Mendel's laws. And more importantly, this is a person called Imre Festetics. Imre Festetics is involved in a great debate within biology between the breeders and the physiologists, and he argues very cogently that the study of heredity should not be treated as a branch of physiology because it is a subject in and of itself. It is dominated by its own laws, which need to be understood in its own terms, not through physiological laws. So Festetics, already about 30 years before Mendel, was arguing that heredity needs to be separately studied as a phenomenon in itself, not as something that physiology will be able to explain or embryology will be able to explain. Very important finding about 30 years before Mendel. At the same time, another person called Prosper Lucas, a medical man in France, again, he was writing about 20, 30 years before Mendel and Darwin. He made the very important point that we need to understand that there are two very distinct aspects of heredity. One is the transmission of information or characteristics from parent to offspring. The other is how do those traits or those characteristics in the offspring develop during the course of its growing up from that information that it has inherited from the parents. In other words, Prosper Lucas made the clear distinction between what we would today call transmission genetics, like Mendel's laws or their extensions to populations in population genetics, versus expression genetics, which includes developmental biology, the control of gene expression patterns in a developing embryo and things like that. So Prosper Lucas, already around 1830, was making this distinction very clearly. And then, of course, Mendel gave us a lot of insight into how heredity actually seems to work. And Darwin created this overarching theory. You can see this large red outline, almost like an amoeba engulfing all these other areas. This is the theory of evolution as put forward by Darwin. And evolution became the great unifier, the great logical unifier in biology, because it brought together development, physiology, heredity, ecology, paleontology, systematics, all into one cogent understanding of how the living world works. So it is actually evolution that provides us the logical structuring to biology. Without evolution, biology would be something like chemistry before the periodic table. See, before periodic table, chemistry was just a collection of facts. If you mix this and this, you get an explosion. If you mix that and that, red colored gas will come out. This will precipitate, this will dissolve. It was a collection of facts about materials. Only after the periodic table and some understanding of atomic theory and so on, that chemistry acquired a certain logical framework. Now we understand why those particular reactions are the way they are. Similarly, prior to evolution, to a very great extent, biology was just a collection of interesting facts about a very diverse set of species of plants, microbes, animals all over the world. The logical structure to biology is provided by evolution. Okay. So one aspect I want to bring out here is that we seem to go through these little cycles of narrow specialization in different sub areas of biology, and then a period of integrating across the narrow specializations. So 17th to mid 1800s was actually quite a lot of specialization, partly because some new technologies like microscopy and various physiological techniques, thanks to advances in physics and chemistry, were becoming available. And so people were specializing in using those techniques and trying to get more understanding out of it. Then the mid 1800s to the early 1900s, there was this huge integration really sparked by evolution bringing everything under its umbrella. in a smaller degree, embryology bringing many disparate things under its umbrella, heredity emerging as a whole subject in itself, and getting integrated along with embryology in terms of expression genetics and along with evolution in terms of transmission genetics. So all this happened. And then the mid 1900s, of course, you all know that we had a beginning of a much more detailed molecular understanding of what is the genetic material, what are proteins, how do proteins work within cells, and so on. So the second half of the 20th century, which coincided with the explosive growth of molecular biology knowledge and techniques, gave rise to again one cycle of extreme specialization. And people became very specialized in the 1970s, 80s, and so on, so much so that today, you know, the department that I belong to is the Department of Organismal and Evolutionary Biology. So we actually have to say as biologists that, you know, we are so sorry we don't study molecules, we study organisms. It's in our department name. That is how specialized we became in the late 20th century. See, before that, in the 1800s, if you asked anybody biology, they would say, that means you study organisms. Today, the default assumption is you study protein molecules or DNA molecules or RNA molecules or something. Not that you actually might be, God forbid, studying real organisms, doing real things in the real nature. From 2000 on, in much of the world, but unfortunately not yet much in India, there's again a big phase of integration happening in biology. People have realized that the late 20th century hyper-specialization has now reached the point of diminishing returns. Now we need to integrate all that knowledge. So the last bit of the talk, I'm going to talk about a few aspects of this integration because we are neglecting this integration in India. We are still stuck in the late 1900s, late 20th century hyper-specialization. I will spend 26 years of my life studying one protein molecule kind of approach to biology. That's not going to take us very far, either in terms of understanding the living world or in terms of tackling the real problems that face us that we discussed in the beginning. So let me ask you a question now. Supposing you were to go and you're planning to purchase a two-wheeler. So this is a question I would like the students in the audience to come up with answers to. What are the characteristics of the two-wheeler that you would be looking at in order to decide which model you want to buy? Okay, somebody said safety features, right? Anybody else? Safety features is one. Mileage, perhaps? Yeah, mileage. Comfort, looks, perhaps acceleration, maintenance, is it going to cost much? Braking, exactly, very important to know that if you have to slam the brakes on a monsoon road, whether your bike will skid or not, wonderful. So we got a whole bunch of characteristics of the bike, tires, yes, and so on. Petrol consumption, yes, whether it's electric or petrol, all these kinds of traits we have thought, right? Now I want you to think about the fact that all the traits we mentioned that we think are important to decide which bike is good for me, all those traits are what you might call bike level traits. They are traits that are the property of the entire bike in a holistic manner. Nobody said that I really want to know the chemistry of how petrol actually gets oxidized in the engine chamber. Nobody said, I want to understand the physics of how when I turn the accelerator in a circular motion, how does that transmit to a linear motion somewhere and back into a different kind of circular motion on the wheel. People talked about the importance of stability and not skidding when you put the brakes on a wet road. Nobody said, I want to study the polymer structure of what kind of, polymeric rubber type material the tire is built upon. So we all focused for the two-wheeler on two-wheeler level traits or characteristic instead of focusing on underlying molecular traits. And this makes sense to us because this is what we intuitively all came up with. If I need to decide whether to buy this red bike on the right or this scooty in the left, I don't need to understand the chemistry of petrol combustion in the engine chamber. But look at the irony that when we shift our attention from two-wheelers to organisms, we suddenly start behaving as if we think only the molecular level of stuff that's happening inside the organism is important, and we don't need to bother about the organism level traits at all. But ultimately, if you want to understand the living world, you want to understand the diversity of the living world and why it is so diverse in the particular way that it is, you need to look at the organism level traits, because that is where the variation is. See, this scooty on the left and bike on the right, the variation is in the vehicle level trait, not in the chemistry of petrol combustion. Similarly, what is happening in the mitochondria, what is happening in an electron transport chain in the chloroplast, that is the same in all species. That's not going to explain why the living world is so diverse, or why it is the way it is, diverse in the specific ways in which it is. So this is one point that's very important, to look at organisms not just at the molecular or cellular level, but in a much more integrative and holistic manner. And this brings me to my point that there are actually two very distinct kinds of biologies. See, we are used to encountering biology as one subject, just as we are used to encountering physics and chemistry as two different subjects, both of which are non-life sciences, if you want to think of it that way. So just as we have two non-life science subjects, physics and chemistry, actually there are two fairly different kinds of biologies also. It's just that historically we have called it one subject of biology. And these two kinds of biologies are asking two very different kinds of questions. The first kind of question is asking, how are living organisms actually alive? How do they tick? What are the mechanisms of life? What is the biochemistry that is happening inside a cell by which energy is being changed from one form to another? How is a protein transmitted across a cell? How do organisms basically do all the things that they need in order to be recognized as living organisms? This is like trying to understand the physics of the transmission shaft of a vehicle, trying to understand the chemistry of petrol combustion, etc., trying to understand the physics of the gearbox, the differential transmission, the steering wheel, and so on. The other kinds of questions that are very important in biology, and indeed this is a whole, more than half of biology in the bottom half of the slide right here, is that any science that calls itself biology, the study of life, has to explain the diversity of life forms. The world, after all, doesn't just consist of one kind of bacterial species. It consists of microbes, it consists of animals, plants, fungi, and within each of these groups there's so much diversity. Why is there so much diversity? We need some explanation for that if we are going to call ourselves biologists. And questions at the top level, the molecular level, are not going to explain why there is so much diversity at all, because anyway, at the molecular level, there is very little diversity. There's actually great similarity of molecular mechanisms at the molecular level. We also need to appreciate that this diversity is not just random. It can be arranged in these kinds of classification schemes, as you see in this middle graphic here. And indeed, Darwin was the first person to really point out that the very fact that you can have a taxonomic classification suggests that species are probably related to each other as ancestors and descendants. That's why you can arrange them like a pedigree in this manner, or like a tree in this manner. So we need to explain the relatedness of life forms of species, and we need to explain the adaptedness of life forms of species. Most species seem to have many characteristics, both the biochemical, behavioral, physiological, structural, morphological, that seem to be very well suited to the kind of ecological context they inhabit. That is what we mean by adaptedness. So any science that is claiming to call itself a biology has to also explain the diversity, the relatedness, and the adaptedness of life forms, in addition to explaining the first kind of question, which is how are living things alive. And these are two completely different kinds of subjects within biology. The nature of the questions asked is very different. Many of the methodologies used are different, some overlap also, but the way we think about biology and organisms when we do these two kinds of biology are actually very different. In fact, these two kinds of biologies are certainly as, if not more different than physics and chemistry are from each other. It's just that traditionally we have thought of biology as one subject and physics and chemistry as two subjects. But really biology encompasses these two sets of questions. And very often you need very different kind of training and education to be good at addressing the top kind of question versus good at being addressing the bottom kind of question, and so on. And the problem that we face in India straight away can be summarized as we are acting when we design our curricula, when we teach in the classrooms, when we teach in school, we teach in colleges. If you look at what comes out in the media about science, we are acting as though this top part of questions about how living things are living, as if this is the only biology or this is the only important biology. It is not uncommon to hear very distinguished scientists today start talks with very unfortunate statements like all biology is chemistry. I'm sorry, but it's not. Or an organism is simply molecules plus mechanism. I'm sorry, but they're not. Organisms have an evolutionary past. They have an immediate developmental sequence past. They are not machines. And a lot of damage has been done to our understanding of biology by unfortunately continuing to think of living organisms or cells as machines. The sooner we drop this, the better. It is damaging the way we understand biology in a very, very, very big way. So we need to understand that biology is not just this top part, but this entire thing. And this bottom part, the broad domains of ecology, evolution, and behavior, this is actually going to be crucial to solving or ameliorating any of these big problems that we talked about, whether they be with human social behavior or biomedical problems or societal problems, disease epidemics, climate change. This bottom half of biology actually is far more important than the top half of biology if we want to solve these problems. And the sooner we wake up and realize this, the better it will be for us as a society. Even right now, I give you just one example of this, which is very contemporary in time, which is the COVID example. The world has fairly rapidly been able to come up with a vaccine for COVID because of advancements in the top part of this. But we really are having a very bad time understanding why COVID is spreading the way it is, why it came into humans in the first place, what facilitated it, how will it spread, what is the projection for what COVID data might look like for the next 6 months in India or in Europe or in America for the next 1 year. Is it likely to become endemic and something that we will keep having to take booster shot vaccinations for? None of that is going to be addressed by the top part of biology here. All of those answers are going to come from here. So it is important to realize that we cannot go on pretending that one part of biology is the whole of meaningful modern biology, and that is molecular biology, and that's all. The rest is all a waste of time, and we will somehow mysteriously and miraculously solve all our problems by doing molecular biology alone. That's just not going to happen. We need to do molecular biology. It's important in its own right. It leads to very interesting things, but it needs to be understood and deployed and practiced in a much broader and much more holistic context of evolution and ecology. And this is something that in India we are neglecting to do. So we are really being very unfair to our students. I'm sorry to say this, but our universities and people like me who are teaching in those universities, we are not really preparing you for 21st century biology. We are preparing you for mid to late 20th century biology still. And I think that's a shame. I think that's an abdication of responsibility on our part. And I hope we do something about it so that we actually train our young people in real, proper, integrative, holistic 21st century biology. Okay, I see that I'm getting a little bit close to time. I just make one or two quick points. One is, so on the bottom here, you see this structural hierarchy of organization of biological system, from molecules to organelles to cells to tissues, tissue systems, organs, organisms, kin groups, that is parents, siblings living together, populations, and actually even communities and ecosystems and so on. So this is a structural hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of structure in biological systems. And very often, people who are interested in structure will choose to focus on molecular level of structure or organ level of structure or organismal level of structure and so on, which is fine. The problem that happens in biology, that although structure is hierarchically organized, functionality is actually integrated across multiple levels. If you want to understand why a frog jumped into the water, you need to integrate everything from the fact that a shadow of a predatory bird passed overhead, which the eyes registered, the brain processed that information, the brain then sent a signal to the legs saying jump into the water. The reason the brain has this ability to send a signal to the legs for the frog to jump into the water when the shadow of an eagle flies overhead is because in the past, those individual frogs who didn't have this capability used to get eaten by eagles before they could produce offspring. And the frogs that happen to have this capability actually were successful at surviving and producing offspring. So now more and more frogs have this ability. And then you need to understand how to nerve impulses travel from the brain to the muscle. You need to understand the molecular level, how the muscle contracts. So you see everything from the molecular to the organismal to the evolutionary is integrated in trying to understand one simple function like jumping away or running away when there is a danger. So the point is that functionality in biological systems is not hierarchically organized, unlike structure. It is integrated across multiple levels of the structural diagram. And that is why an integrative and holistic approach in biology, in addition to being reductionist and finding out things about molecules, is truly important. I just wanted to make a little point here, is that across small jumps in the structural hierarchy, both reductionism and holism work well. If you do reductionism like this, try to understand the cell by coming down, going up from the molecule. So you're understanding what's happening in this organelle by what's happening at the level below, molecular, one level below, or understanding what's happening in the cell 2 levels below molecular. That kind of reductionism, is the red arrows here, is fine. Similarly, that level of holism, with the green arrows, where you are trying to understand the lower level by what is happening at the higher level, that is also fine. So across small jumps of the structural hierarchy, both holistic and reductionist approaches work just pretty well. The problem happens is when we start thinking of larger range jumps across the structural hierarchy. If I want to try to explain what is happening at the protein level inside the cell, this green arrow, if I want to explain how the protein is folding in the cell by what is happening to the organism in its natural environment, you will quite rightly laugh at me and say, come on, this is getting ridiculous, right? But if I'm going to try to explain what's happening to the organism by what's happening to proteins in its cell, it is actually equally ridiculous. But most people today in India think that this is fine and we will explain everything about the organism by the molecules. That is the problem. That is what I said about Indian biology being lopsided. We think that long-range reductionism works just fine, but it actually doesn't. Just like long-range holism also doesn't. Finally, this slide, I just wanted to highlight something. All of this is biology. There's a bunch of biochemistry up here in protein structures and how those proteins bind to DNA and so on. There's anatomy, this is animal tissue, this is plant tissue. There is nonlinear dynamics, time series analysis, understanding behavior, social behavior, how social behaviors evolve, doing laboratory experiments over hundreds of generations to address hypotheses in ecology and evolution, and understanding a lot of what happens in the living world through the medium of mathematical modeling. So all of this is biology. And the reason I wanted to show this slide is, as I said, very often people who like physics or mathematics often get put off with the way biology is taught in school, because you get too much of these two things on the top, and nowadays a lot of too much of this, and you need to memorize all this stuff and all these abbreviations. And if you like conceptual things, if you like abstract thinking, mathematical thinking, you are like, what the hell is this? Who is going to mug up all this? But there's a lot more to biology than just that. So please do look at many areas of biology which are extremely conceptual, rest upon a foundation of mathematical theory, just like physics does. In fact, the second kind of biology I was talking about actually has many similarities in its overall conceptual approach to understanding to physics. Whereas the first kind of biology, how do living things live, the kind of biology that gives you this kind of detail, that has a lot more in common with chemistry, actually. So this is just to make the point that biology is tremendously diverse in terms of the approaches, the concepts we bring to bear on it. I mean, I'm a biologist, I'm a classically trained biologist. My work involves elements from experimental evolution, animal behavior, ecology, biochemistry, genomics, molecular biology, mathematical modeling, computer simulations, agent-based modeling, statistics, and pretty much everything, right? Part of our interest in nonlinear dynamics being what it is, our lab actually has solved some problems in physics that the physicists were not able to solve for 20 years. So please don't think that biology is just all about making these lovely looking diagrams and mugging up long lists of things. There's a lot more to it. And many areas of biology are very, very, very conceptually rich, except that unfortunately, those are the areas that in India we are trying to pretend don't exist or are not important. And I'll leave you at the end with just a couple of small pieces of information, just another 1 or 2 minutes. I'm sure most of you probably don't know that there is a particular area within biology in which more than half the research groups in the world that do that kind of work are actually in India. There is one area within biology that has this unique distinction, and that is experimental evolution, long-term, multi-generational studies of evolutionary and ecological questions in the laboratory. More than half of the research groups in the world that do this long-term experimental evolution as their primary research work are actually in India. There is no other area in biology for which this can truly be served. And this is just a little photograph of 2 of our young and extremely active evolutionary biologists, Dr. Sutirth Dey from IISER Pune, Dr. N.G. Prasad from IISER Mohali, along with Professor Lawrence Mueller and Professor Michael Rose, who were quite literally the pioneers or the founders of modern day experimental evolution in the 1970s. That's one point. And the second point I'll just leave you with, and this is again just to make the point that although in India we spend so much time pretending as if ecology and evolution is not important or doesn't exist or should be neglected, and focusing almost entirely on molecular biology, actually the greatest contributions to the growth of biological knowledge from India over the last 40-50 years have actually come from ecology and evolution, not from molecular biology. And one little example of that I'm personally very happy about, because this was work done long ago in my lab. So this book here was recently published a couple of years ago. It's called Conceptual Breakthroughs in Evolutionary Ecology. It lists and describes and talks about 65 major studies starting from Darwin in 1859 till the present day, so about 170 years time span. It lists out and discusses 65 major studies that the author felt were major conceptual breakthroughs in evolutionary ecology from Darwin till today. And there is one Indian study that finds a place in that 65. It is actually the only non-Western country study that finds a place in there. And that was done by our lab way back more than almost 20 years ago in 2003. And this was a paper published at that time called The Evolution of Population Stability as a byproduct of life history evolution. And this was considered an important enough conceptual breakthrough to find a place in this book. And again, this work did not involve anything molecular whatsoever, It did involve understanding a lot of theory and then doing interesting multi-generation experiments in the lab to test predictions from that theory. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your patience. I'll be very happy to address any questions.